All right, Stuart and Cliffe Knechtle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us,
Jake.
So, how do you know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God?
I know Jesus Christ is the Son of God because he claims it through 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John, even though some would say, well, that came later. Well, it didn't come a whole lot later, maybe 80 AD or even earlier. And then I would go to Mark. You have angels. When they receive worship, they say, no, we are not worthy. But every time Jesus receives worship, he says, yes, I am worthy, or he remains silent, but he certainly never rejects it. Then he's killed as King of the Jews, and people would have understood that as certainly a claim. And then he walks on water, another form of a claim that actually harkens back to the Old Testament in Isaiah. And so many of his claims always harken back to the Old Testament. And then they're right up in your face, obviously, in the Gospel of John, where you have before Abraham was, I am. So the great I am statements, clearly everybody standing there would have understood that he was claiming to be God. Now, whether he was God or not, that's for people to decide. But it's pretty clear that he was making this claim.
But how do we know the claim is valid? Like he said that in the Bible, but how do we know that it's true?
Josephus, Tacitus, Celsus, many others claimed him to be a historical figure. But then Josephus especially was saying that all these Christians popped up and were walking around saying that this guy was beyond just a philosopher or a miracle worker, but they claimed that he was the Son of God. So again, that's not proof that he was the Son of God, but the claims certainly were there outside of the Bible.
Do you mind if I dive into those for a moment, Josephus and Tacitus specifically?
Sure.
So Josephus, this is CC AD 37 through 100 CE. So the primary passage referencing Jesus, this is Testonium Flavianum, is that right, Cliff? Antiquities 18.33 is widely acknowledged to have been tampered with by later Christian scribes. The original text likely mentioned Jesus, but did not affirm his divinity or miracles. And the thing is, Stuart, my understanding is that even in its untampered form, Josephus would be reporting hearsay, not direct observation or reliable evidence of supernatural events.
Well, okay, look at Larry Hurtado, the incredible historian out of Marquette, who sadly passed away not too long ago. And he's written, I love the title, Who Would Ever Want to Be a Christian in the First 300 Years AD? And then he also wrote Destroyer of the Gods and many others. And all of them are hearkening back again to the earliest Christians were giving up property. They were.
But just so I'm following, are we moving on from Josephus?
Well, I mean, we can stay on Josephus. You're exactly right. He was definitely in some ways twisted at certain times. But no, Josephus at many points talked about these crazy Christians and how they worshipped this miracle worker who they also claimed to be God. So it was way beyond just the passage that you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy, but it wasn't direct observation, right? This was hearsay.
Right.
So why are we using that as I know you say there's other sources, we can talk about those, but each individual source, I'm having a hard time, Josephus doesn't seem like a reliable source because it's not direct observation.
Well, no,
right?
he just borrowed from all the eyewitnesses, though. He was tuning in fully to the eyewitnesses and all these claims who were around Jesus saying, this guy claimed to be God. And the Romans and the Jews eventually said, we got to kill this guy because he's making all these claims. Now, either they were idiots and everybody was misunderstanding his claims as in the tune to thousands and thousands. So maybe he wasn't making the claim. But I think based off of eyewitness testimony, and then obviously Josephus after that eyewitness testimony and others, you look at two famous emperors as well. Even I think Nero may have mentioned it, but there are ancient manuscripts talking about torturing female disciples because they were making these wild claims that Jesus actually was making this claim and they were willing to die for it. So no, yeah, you got to look at the eyewitness testimony as well of those who were surrounding Jesus, whether the claims were there or not.
And then you also mentioned Tacitus, because Tacitus does mention Christians and their founder Christus in the Annals. This is 15.44. But my understanding is that the passage only states that Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. It doesn't confirm miracles, divinity, or resurrection. And then the account was written a century after Jesus' death and likely reflects information from Christian sources rather than independent verification. So, really what I'm trying to do here is understand, is there evidence that Jesus was Son of God? If so, let me accept that Jesus is Son of God right now, because that would be really important that I do that. And I want to ask about evidence, and if the evidence doesn't hold up, then I don't want to believe that Jesus is Son of God. But if it does hold up, then I do want to believe it, and everyone should if there's real evidence. But so far, Josephus and Tacitus are not legitimate evidence for a supernatural event, because they're not. It's Josephus is reporting hearsay, and then Tacitus, I mentioned, it's not even talking about divinity. It's just talking about that he was executed. So is there any evidence that Jesus is Son of God?
Well, those are two different questions. You were initially talking about did the claim to be, and then the second is, was he the Son of God?
Yeah.
So are you asking about the claims, or are you asking about whether he was the Son of God? Because if we're moving on to the Son of God, then you're going to have to weigh the evidence of whether he was resurrected or not.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, like, what my only question today in a short amount of time is Jesus Christ truly the Son of God?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
Sure. I don't want to take the whole time, so you chip in whenever you want.
First of all, in order to answer your question, you've got to figure out, did Jesus claim to be God in human form? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul all insist that he did. In Philippians chapter 2 and in Colossians chapter 1, Paul quotes hymns or creeds of the early church that declare the deity of Christ. When you push the historical record of the early first century church back to the earliest time, you never have a non-deity called Jesus. He's always worshipped as God. So it's clear that by both his words and his actions, from reading the Gospels and then Peter and James and Paul, that Christ claimed to be God. Then the second question is, why would you trust those outrageous claims? And the answer to that is because the historical evidence found in the Gospels is that he lived a sinless life. He taught amazing ethical teachings. He died on a cross forgiving his enemies, which obviously demands respect, as he lives up to that incredibly high ethical standard to forgive you and love your enemy. But then 3 days later, he rises from the dead. So you put those four pieces of evidence together: his lifestyle, his ethical teachings, which were obviously the teachings of an ethical genius. Thirdly, his death. And fourthly, his resurrection. It's rather clear that the evidence is you can trust him when he claims to be God in human form.
How do we know the Gospels are the truth? I mean, because we're saying that like, we're assuming the Gospels are inherently trustworthy, right, Cliff?
No, we're not assuming the Gospels are historically accurate. You have to put together some tests, if you're an honest thinking person, to determine the historicity of any document. I don't care if it's history of Africa, history of the United States, the Quran, the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, or the Gospels. You have to put together tests. My tests are 4 in number: internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence. If you don't like those tests, I will not be offended, but I'm going to hold you to make sure that you come up with your own tests that you use consistently to determine the historical reliability of any document.
I do. Sorry, I'm sorry for interrupting you. And I'm sorry for how abrasive I'm being throughout this. I don't mean to be so combative.
You're not being abrasive.
No, we like that you're getting right to it. This is good.
Yeah.
I'd be more softer if we had more time, but I have to get right to it. So, Cliff, the four things you lean on are what? History, archaeology,
internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence. And I use those 4 tests on any document that claims to be historical. And then what I said to you, Jake, was if you don't like those tests, I'm not offended, but I am going to hold you to be intellectually consistent, which means please give me the tests that you use that are realistic tests that you use on any document.
Well, I think I would use the same. Internal consistency, literary style. What was the third and fourth?
Archaeological evidence and manuscript evidence.
And so I would use the same 4, frankly. And what I would say is that so the internal. So your question is, those are the 4 you use. Would I use the same or different? And I don't disagree with you. I think those are fantastic pillars to lean on to ascertain truth. Internal consistency, Cliff, I assume you're saying the Gospels are internally consistent and therefore reliable, and therefore the consistency of the accounts proves their accuracy and truthfulness. And I think that internal consistency matters, which is why I don't trust the Gospels, because there are contradictions in the Gospels, right? There's numerous discrepancies in key narratives. For example, there's the birth narratives. Matthew and Luke disagree on Jesus's genealogy and the events surrounding his birth. I can dig into that. There's different resurrection accounts. The Gospels differ on who discovered the empty tomb, how many angels were present, and what Jesus said to his followers afterwards. So these contradictions undermine the claim of internal consistency. There's also differences that reflect theological agendas. Now I don't. Anyway, so I agree. Consistency matters. There's no consistency. The literary style shows theological intent. They were not pure historical documents because there's symbolic and exaggerated elements like miracles walking on water, and they use a messianic secret motif. There's no mention of authors. Their gospels were anonymous with titles Matthew, Mark, Luke. Sorry, I don't want to ramble, but the point is that I agree that those are 4 good pillars to stand on. Can you tell me how I'm wrong about the consistency point?
You bet. You have not given us one solid contradiction. The 2 genealogies in Matthew and Luke do not contradict each other. When you study genealogies, you realize often they're talking about family group. The proof of that is from Matthew's genealogy, which he lumps into 14, 14, and 14. And obviously, there are some that are excluded. Some individuals are excluded. Luke tips us off to the fact that when he says Jesus was the son, so it was thought of, and he lists some males. But the main point of Luke is he didn't have an earthly father. So possibly the genealogy in Luke is Mary's genealogy. So when you
but Matthew includes the visit of Magi. Luke mentions the shepherd and a census, which is historically
and I can promise
right?
you, Jake, that when Stuart and I communicate to our wives tonight, our wonderful discussion with you, we are going to include different details. Including different details is not a contradiction. It is a different, unique perspective.
Just like with the angels. Look, if both eyewitnesses showed up.
Wait. So, but you're saying they're consistent. I'm pointing out inconsistencies, and you're saying inconsistencies are allowed. So, which is it?
Yeah, inconsistencies, in a sense, they're allowed, not contradictions. But if you have collusion going on with the exact same details, which it sounds like you're trying to have, well, that's total collusion. We should throw out all the Gospels. But there should be levels of discrepancies.
So it's not. Sorry. So maybe I'm being too literal. It seems like there are discrepancies, but that those are not that severe. I guess what I saw is I thought the genealogies were contradictory. Like Matthew and Luke. So Matthew traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, starting with Abraham and proceeding through King David through Solomon. Luke traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, but goes back to Adam and lists David's son as Nathan, not Solomon. So that would be a discrepancy, right? Matthew says that Jesus is born during King Herod's reign. But I think the bigger picture here is I look at like biblical sources as just works of fiction that were created by people at the time to create a narrative to bind the community together. And I look for external sources to validate them as to whether they're true.
That's a pretty tough narrative to come up with.
Yeah.
Tossing out all your property, throwing out your kids to be killed on the street by the Romans because you made these claims. Why in the world would you go by this type of communal binding narrative when it just ended up getting you torn apart by the lions in the Roman Colosseum at the end of the day? I would want a different type of communal narrative, maybe one that's more polytheistic and tolerant so that I could truly be welcomed. And we can have the type of binding story that you're talking about.
So the contradictions that I think I'm mentioning, Cliff, are those like legitimate? The things I'm pointing out about the genealogies, is that
totally illegitimate? Because you're right. The word consistency, you and I are defining differently.
Okay.
A contradiction is A and non-A cannot both be true at the same time in the same way. That's a contradiction. Okay.
Mark said Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour, and John said he was sentenced at the 6th hour. Is that a contradiction?
Not when you study how different Judeans and Galileans kept a different calendar.
Okay.
Sunrise for the
Galileans
Galileans was the start of the day.
Okay.
The Judeans, sunset was the start of a new day. So when you begin to study the different calendars and the different way they were kept by the Judeans and the Galileans, that's why there's a big, quote, contradiction about when the Passover took place. No, there's no contradiction, because the Galileans measured a day from sunrise to sunrise. The Judeans measured a day from sunset to sunset. So the Last Supper was not Friday night. It was Thursday night, and Jesus was crucified on Friday evening.
Got it. So I see. So they're keeping track of, and the second point is literary style. And and the third is archaeological evidence. What archaeological evidence is there of that Jesus is the Son of God?
There is no. We're not talking about Jesus as being the Son of God. Now we're talking about the reliability of the text. That was the question you
Got it.
asked. So the archaeological evidence is that the Gospels do not talk about the island of Atlantis. They talk about the pool of Siloam, which was archaeologically verified by an archaeological dig several years ago. We're talking about Bethlehem and Nazareth. I was at UC Santa Barbara, and a student stepped out of the crowd and said, there's no archaeological evidence that Nazareth was a town in first century Palestine. I didn't know, so I went home and studied it, and no, there's plenty of archaeological evidence, pottery, inscriptions on caves in Nazareth, that Nazareth was a town in first century Palestine, which is where Jesus grew up in Nazareth.
And they think they have found his tomb buried underneath a church that is pretty well documented as well archaeologically.
But is it possible that both are true? You know, these places existed, Nazareth existed, but then woven within the story are things that weren't true? Like, how do we know that these supernatural things happen? Like, I know there's truths in the Bible. There's certain things that really did happen. But how do we know it's all true? I like, a lot of people struggle with the talking snake, you know, the miracles. They say, well, how do we know it happened? Like, yeah, Nazareth was a place, and
well, you go back to
Bethlehem.
Josephus. Go back to Josephus and Tacitus and others.
Yeah.
They weren't the only ones who talked about this miracle worker who was actually doing miracles.
Yeah.
And so were they just lying? What were they getting out of that in lying?
A lot.
No.
I mean, people make up, like, you don't believe in every religion, right? Like, people, like, religions
But
are
they're the enemies of the Christian faith. They're the enemies. If they were sympathizers, yes, of course they would make it up. But these are enemies of the Christian faith, claiming that this was an incredible miracle worker.
Here, I'm gonna jump to my last question, because is there anything I could say to you guys that would convince you that Jesus Christ is not the Son of God?
Sure, very simple. Just show us the evidence is that he did not rise from the dead.
That's a logical fallacy. I can't prove to you that there's no.
No, you can't prove anything. Just give me evidence. Hopefully I said the word evidence.
Yeah.
Evidence that Christ did not rise from the dead, that this was a hoax, a sham, that this is historically inaccurate.
Maybe an ossuary too, with some DNA evidence.
Yeah.
Or perhaps just a lot of evidence around this ossuary that is found with clearly his name, and perhaps some scrolls that are found as well, talking about this made up, communally binding narrative that you're talking about.
But doesn't the, like, but it's a negative claims are usually unfalsifiable. Like, if I say that there's a big flying spaghetti monster, and then you say, if I don't, you know,
Well,
prove to me
on this real fast, Jake. I'm not asking you for a negative proof, okay? What I'm asking you is to look at the evidence, to tell me the evidence is not enough, and then to show me the alternative. And here's the key, Jake. Show me the alternative that is supported by more evidence. That's all you got to do.
So I think the alternative that's supported by more evidence, and like I learned this by reading historians of how religion came into being, is people like Yuval Noah Harari that explain that human beings dating back thousands of years used, first it was animism, you know, describing like the soul and spirit of like a tree or a rock, and how that morphed into polytheism, and how polytheism morphed into monotheism to create a structure of meaning for human beings. So that's my explanation. Is I think people come up, like, in the way that you look at other religions like Hinduism or Buddhism, or Islam or Judaism, is how I kind of look at Christianity. Like, you accept that there are other religions that are just stories that people use. You don't think they're true. So that's
not
my
true.
explanation.
That's inaccurate. If you tell me that Muhammad never lived, I'm going to tell you you're unwise.
No, I'm saying he never, but
the
he was.
Historical evidence is Muhammad was born about 570 and died about 632 AD.
But do you believe that he was you believe that he was a divine person?
He would have cut your head off if you had gone up to him and worshipped him. He clearly said, Allah is God, I am not God. And he also said Jesus is not God. But he also claimed to be revealing Allah accurately. And I think when you read the evidence of his lifestyle, teachings, death, and what happened after his death, the evidence is, I don't know that you should trust him to be an accurate source of information about God.
Yeah, Jake, I would just be careful with your thinking there. I think you should get a totally different type of worldview and theory on religion, because Joseph Campbell, very similar, just in a different way. Hero with 1,000 faces in terms of all the religions and how they come up and how they benefit us. But with the Christian faith, you talk about a falsifiable fact, or at least a claim, that would be the resurrection. So that's the linchpin. It's the only religion that lies upon a historical claim, whether it occurred or not. You're right. Well, you're wrong, actually. All the other religions don't do that. It's only the Christian faith. So just to say, oh, all these religions just kind of morphed and people found maybe some evolutionary benefit from them, you're not looking at the historical evidence at all. The 66 books that are all making these claims. You have to unearth these and deal with these. It's not just some religion that's making these types of religious claims to make us feel better. It's the opposite of that. It's dealing with real history.
I understand the Gospels are widely copied and disseminated, like tons of them. I mean, there's lots of legends that have been disseminated. There are textual variants among the 5,800 Greek manuscripts, but the fact that they were disseminated doesn't prove that they're true. You're saying there's a lot of other corroborating works.
Yeah.
Right.
The fact that they're disseminated. I mean, look at what AI and drones are doing right now in terms of how many more manuscripts are popping up. It's over 6,000 now. And a lot of archaeologists are saying it's only going to grow. And by the way, those aren't Christian archaeologists saying that. So no, in no way does that prove the Gospels, but it definitely gets us back to the earliest autograph, which then is incredible evidence for. I mean, you look at obviously Tiberius Caesar. He had 4 sources. We have 4 sources. He popped up 80 AD though, in terms of those sources connecting to his life. Our sources pop up within just a couple of days based off of what Paul talks about. His claims, at least, no proof, but his claims, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. And so you have to deal with these. You have to wrestle with them. You can't just come out and say, hey, this is a type of religion that is just like all others and how it came about.
Yeah. Cliff, I said, hey, guys, what could I say to convince you that Jesus Christ was not resurrected, was not the Son of God? And Cliff, you said, show me evidence that shows that. And I want to come back to my point, which is that like negative claims are near impossible to prove. If I say, Cliff, I believe in a flying spaghetti monster, prove to me it doesn't exist, you wouldn't be able to. There's no such thing as that.
Jake, I miscommunicated. I apologize.
No,
Let me rephrase to you. All you have to do to disprove Christianity is to show that there is not enough evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. That's Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ is not risen from the dead, we're a pack of fools for following him. So all you got to show is, no, there is not enough evidence to support the resurrection of Christ.
But and this is where we disagree. I feel like in talking about Josephus and talking about Tacitus, we didn't get to talk about coins and archaeology.
I don't care about them, Jake. All right, they're irrelevant.
So you're
Matthew,
saying
Mark, Luke, John, and Paul.
But those are 4 guys from 2,000 years ago. Like the Gospels were traditionally attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? But those attributions were made long after the texts were written. So scholars today, and you might not believe these people, but scholars today widely agree that the Gospels were written anonymously and the true authors are unknown. And so that would undermine the claim that the Gospels represent first-hand eyewitness testimony.
Well, it very clearly shows, Jake, that you've not studied the issue carefully. There is disagreement about who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I can promise you, there is lots of evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their respective Gospels. And even if they didn't, so what? It's not that important. The point is, these were eyewitness accounts that were studied in the first century by the first century followers of Christ. Paul obviously wrote 1 Corinthians, and he clearly talks about the resurrection of Christ and how over 500 people saw him.
And when do we believe eyewitness accounts and when don't we? Like, you don't believe in Mormonism, even though Mormonism was created by supposed eyewitness accounts, right?
No, false. I do believe that a guy named Joseph Smith really lived.
Yeah,
what I don't believe is what he taught. But historically, Joseph Smith really existed.
But why don't you believe in the miracles that Mormons believe in, that he did?
I'm not sure I know of too many miracles they claim he did. Now, they claim that the
found the book.
Jewish people came over to United States, to North America. And my point is there's no evidence archaeologically to defend the idea that Jews came over to the North American shores.
Or I'm sorry, like what I'm trying to ask is like, you're saying eyewitness testimonies. What I'm saying is other religions have supposed eyewitness testimonies that you don't believe. Like In Islam, I think they believe that Muhammad ascended to the heavens, and there were eyewitnesses for that. But you don't believe that Muhammad ascended to the heavens, even though there were eyewitnesses.
No, there's very, very little evidence that anybody saw Muhammad ascend to heaven. Very little. That is a step of really rather great step of faith in the book, the Quran.
Yeah.
Quran states it, so therefore it is. But no, there's not solid evidence that Muhammad ascended to heaven.
And the evidence, like, so you're saying if I want to prove to you that Jesus is not Son of God, that I have to show you that there's not enough evidence of it,
of his resurrection.
So, and then I mentioned Josephus and Tacitus. You're saying that's not relevant. So then I mentioned Mark. I mentioned the Gospels, how it's not written by them. You said that's not true. There were other people that say that they did write it. Were there historians that said that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, or is it?
Some historians, yes, and some disagree. So there's disagreement among different scholars of the New Testament.
Church fathers like Papias stated that. So, for example, Mark, he stated that Mark and that Peter was Mark's sidekick, for example, and that Mark was writing about Peter's life.
Got it. Let me shift with a couple of minutes. Stuart and Cliff, and thank you for doing this. I'm an abrasive person.
Not at all.
No, you're
not even half as abrasive as
man. Come on.
Now you got to compliment me because I'm putting myself down. So, when did you guys become religious? Were you born religious?
I became religious as a result of observing my friends' lives, my life, my family's life. I became religious as a result of going out into the fields at night, looking up at the stars and beginning to ask, is this an accident, or is it more reasonable to believe that there's an intelligent mind behind this? I became religious when I experienced love and asked, is this just a chemical reaction, the way my biology teacher is telling me? Or is there something more to this than just a chemical reaction? I became religious when I began to read the Gospels and examine the historical Jesus Christ. And I began to be open to the possibility of miracles happening, because indeed there is a supernatural God. The evidence points to that. And then when I saw the evidence for the resurrection, it convinced me, indeed, Jesus is true. And then I had an experience of Christ. I put my faith in him and experienced his love and his presence. And so that convinced me that he was true.
I became a full-blown agnostic theist my sophomore year in college, because I had a lot of Mormon friends and everybody kept calling them brainwashed. And so all of a sudden I looked in the mirror one day and said, whoa, hold on here. Am I brainwashed? I better check things out. And so I checked out hedonism quite a bit. I found that philosophy of life to be the most tantalizing. I checked out Hinduism, Buddhism, atheism, agnosticism, as many of the worldviews as I possibly could. And I just couldn't find a better alternative. So honestly, it was the alternatives being bankrupt that led me back to my faith. And then that pushed me to evidence.
Did it have to be one though? Like you were saying, you basically had the conclusion, like, let me find which one of these is true. And then you found the one that's true. Like, did it have to be one? What I'm saying is, like, was it a necessary conclusion that, one of these has got to be true? Like, I have no doubt that for you, Christianity is better than the other religions. My question is, you went into it saying, well, like, how did you know one of the religions had to be true?
Everybody forms a worldview to make sense of life.
Yeah.
And just a basic boiling it down to theism or atheism, the great David Foster Wallace said, everybody worships something.
Yeah.
If you worship something here on this planet, ultimately, it will eat you alive. Your looks, you worship your looks, you'll die 1,000 deaths before actually dying. If you worship something infinite, though, that will give you the most flourishing life imaginable. And he was an atheist. Sadly, he ended up hanging himself for mental health reasons. But it just boils down to your very daily existence. Do you live as if there is a God, or if there's not? Do you live as if to be a kind person, for human rights, to sacrifice for others, to consider others even better than yourself at times? Well, then you're being entirely Christian. You're just growing up in a Judeo-Christian value system, a worldview. And I think you should stop doing that if you're going to be consistent as someone like an atheist.
I think it's important to have a sense of morality, Cliff and Stuart. And like you said, everyone wants meaning. I want meaning. Everyone wants connection to a higher power. It brings us meaning. And I think, all the religions will say that, right? Like, Jews and Buddhists and Christians and Muslims will all say what I just said, which is they want to have good morals. They want to have a connection to a higher power. Is that fair? Do you think that other religions can help people in the way that Christianity can, or to some extent in the way Christianity can?
Yeah, I enjoy that secular humanism has grown a little bit in our country. I'd rather you be a humanist than a nihilist, because you're for humanity and you're buying into an ethical system that is just riding the fumes of the Judeo-Christian faith. And so, yeah, be a secular humanist.
What
rather
about
than a nihilist
what
who just
about
wants to end their
a
life.
Jew or what about a Jew or a Muslim? I mean, is there any merit to these other religions, do you think? Or
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the monotheistic religions are after a God. Now, who has the most evidence that that God is real, or is that God not real? And I believe Islam, as well as Judaism, as well as Christianity, are the three monotheistic religions. But even Hinduism, it gets back to morality. Is there objective morality or not? Is there morals outside of just our subjective experience? Is there a law above the cultural law?
Mhm.
And all those religions are pointing to yes. But if you're an atheist, you have to say no.
Jake, you've asked great questions. We need to get moving,
Okay.
unfortunately. But
All right.
Jake,
Thank
I'm
you.
not blowing smoke when I tell you, thank you for your hard questions. We don't want to waste time sitting around here. And you got right to the main issues, and I appreciate that
Right.
a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for the time, Stuart. I'll follow up. Hope we can do more of this. I know you guys are busy. I know other people that maybe we could all can. Anyway, so I'll leave it here. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you,
time,
Jake.
Jake.
It was great.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Good to meet you, man.
Good to meet you. Thank you.